Trent Alexander earned his BA in history from Columbia University in 1992, followed by a 2001 PhD from Carnegie Mellon University. After graduation, he took a position at the University of Minnesota as a research scientist, including work with the Integrated Public Use Microdata Samples project there, before moving in 2010 to the Census Bureau, where he became assistant chief in the Center for Research Using Administrative Records, such as the Decennial Census and the American Community Survey. He moved to the University of Michigan in 2017, where he took over as Associate Director of the International Consortium for Political and Social Research, another large project that provides census and survey data to researchers all over the world. This article, published in 1998, was one spin-off from his doctoral dissertation about race and community in the 20th century exodus from the American South, which he called the Great Migration. Although this topic is also about internal migrations between regions inside the United States, it also involves an element of moving from rural to urban areas, although we will see that Alexander qualifies this common perception of the Great Migration, since it was not true for everyone. That forms the subject for Trent Alexander's research offers one of the most fascinating examples of population movements seen in the 20th century. In one way, this topic fits with the study of internal migration between different regions of a country, but here we consider it in a different light. It also involved movement of millions of Americans from rural to urban areas, and so it fits with the study of the more specific phenomenon of urbanization in societies. Research on the Great Migration in the United States during the 20th century often focuses on movements of the black population, as Alexander does in his article, but it is important to remember that large numbers of whites also moved out of the American South and into cities in the northern and Pacific states during this period. Alexander follows the main outlines of previous scholarship on the Great Migration in distinguishing between what he calls two waves of population movement. The first wave began to build up after 1910 as the twin processes of industrialization and urban growth got a boost first from wartime production demands during World War I, and even more strongly during the 1920s when the United States slammed the door on international immigrants. At that point, rapidly growing industrial centers, hungry for more and more factory workers, had nowhere to turn except the more rural and economically stagnant southern states. So they launched massive recruitment efforts to induce people to relocate within the United States. In particular, these efforts focused on the rural South and the black population. The response came immediately and enthusiastically. At the turn of the century, in 1900, for example, the population of South Carolina was 50% black and 50% white. By the end of the Great Migration, one half of the entire black population of the state had vanished, and the state was 1/3 black and 2/3 white. This population movement tended to follow three distinct corridors, with migrants from the southern Atlantic coast migrating to East Coast cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York City, while migrants from the East-South Central states of Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, and Mississippi mostly migrated due north into the industrial heartland of Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, and other Midwestern cities. A stream of migrants, mostly from southern states further to the west, including Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas, tended more often to move out to the West Coast instead, especially to California. The Great Depression in the 1930s greatly reduced the volume of internal migration inside the United States, just as it affected international population movements. But the wartime production needs of the United States during the 1940s, and then the economic boom that followed the war, again tremendously expanded the urgent demand for more workers and restarted a second wave of the Great Migration, even much larger than the first population shift. The geographic contours of this second wave were almost identical to the first in terms of general regions of the country that sent and received migrants, reproducing the three corridors of movement. Some scholars date the end of this second wave to about 1970, but throughout the 1960s the rate of migration out of the South was falling rapidly, so that after 1960 the Great Migration was only a shadow of its former self. Alexander joins many other contemporary historians by taking issue in particular with one of the early assumptions about this great migration. This assumption was applied earlier in the 20th century to both the flood of international immigrants who arrived from the late 1800s into the 1920s, and then to the flood of internal migrants relocating to the growing industrial cities in the half-century that followed the cutoff of immigration in the 1920s. Early accounts of the lives of all these migrants are nicely captured in the title of a book published in the 1950s by Oscar Handlin called The Uprooted. He looked at immigrants and saw people who had lost touch with the familiar cultural world where they'd been born, who had been transported long distances, and who suddenly found themselves thrown into new and alien social environments where they faced problems of language, customs, and discrimination from the local native-born population, who often feared and resented them. These uprooted people, Handlin supposed, constituted a huge social problem. They were liable to various kinds of mental illnesses and might even become a source of criminal behavior if they could not be assimilated into the new urban American world where they found themselves. Alexander points us far back beyond these early 20th century interpretations of the effects of migration, back to the British writer Ravenstein, who in the 1800s had published a couple of classic articles setting out what he claimed were basic laws of migration. The very first of these so-called laws proposed that most migrants move only short distances, pushed by problems at their place of origin and drawn towards what he called centers of absorption, that is, places where they could find better jobs, a higher standard of living, and so on, or in other words, usually towards big cities. As the old song asks, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? This law proposed by Ravenstein has an important present-day implication for Alexander and for many of his colleagues. Since most migrants move only short distances, and since rural Alabama is actually quite a long way from Detroit or Chicago, most migrants are unlikely to make the whole journey in one fell swoop. More likely, Alexander suggests, is that people will move from rural Alabama farms to nearby towns, then perhaps a few years later from these towns to Birmingham or Montgomery, and possibly after that from Birmingham to Chicago. These stages of the move constitute what has become known as step migration. If a person takes several of these steps himself or herself, traveling all the way from a rural birthplace in the Deep South to an apartment building in Detroit, Alexander calls this one-generational step migration. On the other hand, if a person moves to Montgomery and stays there, and then the children from that family move on to Chicago, that would be intergenerational step migration. Alexander also distinguishes two very different theoretical senses in which we might talk about such step migration. The first of these he calls spatial step migration, and this is the simpler version that limits itself more strictly to Ravenstein's original first law. Here we're just talking about distance. Birmingham is a lot closer to home than is Chicago for our hypothetical migrant. Each step along the migratory journey covers a limited distance. Migration, you might say, is limited by a horizon in terms of sheer physical distance that people can comfortably travel and still feel at home in a new destination. Therefore, the move from the farm to Detroit will be accomplished in shorter steps, each leading in the general direction of the eventual destination, but with several stops along the way. The more complicated version of step migration considers the idea of distance in more than just a geographic sense. Central place theory emerged in geographic studies in Europe as scholars tried to explain why some cities grew to enormous size while other places remained little farming villages. The basic idea involves a spatial network of places, with the smallest places scattered in profusion over the landscape. But if one such little village happened to be placed at the center of a web of several other places, it might become a transportation and communication hub where people from all around could come for specialized services. Every village might have a basic school, but in the central town you might find a high school. These towns form a higher order network of their own, and central places in that network might grow into cities, with a university, for example, hospitals, and other specialized services. Finally, at the center of a network of cities, you might find a metropolis like Atlanta, providing everything from a major airport to sports stadiums for professional teams, high-level government offices, and so on. In other words, as you go up the ladder or hierarchy of central places, the specialized functions available at each level of central place become more extensive and diverse. Step migration sometimes has been suggested to climb up this hierarchical ladder of specialization and diversity of available services, adding a separate sort of direction to expected streams of migration. Alexander wants to look for both spatial and this more complicated hierarchical version of step migration to see whether the data he considers shows any evidence of either pattern. The two waves of the Great Migration to the period between 1910 and 1930 for the first wave, and from 1940 to 1960 or 1970 for the second wave, it might seem more than a little strange to find out that the census data that Alexander uses to look at actual migration patterns comes from only the 1940 census and only looks back as far as 1935. This means he's only observing migration for one short 5-year period, and that this short period came in the middle of the lowest level of population mobility observed at any time during the whole Great Migration period. But here we have a great example of one of the eternal inconveniences of the social scientist. We don't have control over our subject matter the way that bench sciences like chemistry do. We can't set up social experiments using any arbitrary experimental design that we might find useful. The hundreds of millions of people that we want to study would object. So we have to be content to study whatever data we can find and to hope that we can approximate what some people call natural experiments. That is, situations that happen to allow us to isolate one possible explanation from other possibilities and to test some basic hypotheses. In this case, Alexander is relying on a question first asked in the 1940 Census of Population. Where did you live 5 years ago? The answers to this question allow him to identify people by where they were counted in 1940 and then to cross-classify those places with where the same people said they lived 5 years earlier. If that was someplace different, for example, if somebody counted in Chicago said she was living in Alabama 5 years ago, presto, you have a migrant. For the distinction between rural and urban places, he uses the official census definition of any incorporated place with more than 2,500 people as urban. Everybody else was rural. I remember a couple of little towns in South Carolina, one with 2,300 people and the other with 2,600 people, which meant that the folks in the slightly larger town were always reminding the people in the other town about which place was urban and which one was rural. Alexander also separates out another urban category, including only people who lived in places with at least 100,000 people. Pittsburgh, the focus of his research, was one of these larger places. His figure 2 shows us all the Black Americans who moved from anywhere in the South to urban places, meaning places with more than 2,500 people, dividing those destinations between cities in the South and cities in the North. We can see that over half of all the people who moved into cities in the South were coming from rural areas, in this case also in the South. But only about a third of the migrants to cities in the North were coming from rural areas in the South. The other side of this coin is that only about 1 in 10 of the people moving to southern cities were coming from other southern cities of over 100,000 people. But over 1/4 of all the people moving to cities in the North were actually coming from large cities in the South. Alexander interprets this contrast or differential in the urban origins of migrants as his first bit of evidence in support of step migration. While the migrants from rural areas to southern cities are not the same people as the migrants from those southern cities to the northern cities, the sizes of these categories of migrants suggest that we might be looking at people who are at different stages along just the kind of step migration process that he has envisioned. Since the second step of this process is from large southern to large northern cities, we can't really call this hierarchical step migration, but it could well be spatial step migration. In fact, the rural and urban origins of the people moving to small and to large southern cities, as shown in his figure 3, are almost identical. the share moving from large southern cities to small southern cities is actually a little greater than the share moving from one large southern city to another. And Alexander concludes that there is little or no evidence of the more complicated hierarchical version of steppe migration showing up in this figure. To put this another way, the share of migrants from large southern cities to small northern cities is actually larger than the share of migrants moving between large southern cities. Such movements to smaller northern cities would actually be going against the current of hierarchical steppe migration and would have to be explained in some completely other different terms. So there's evidence in both these figures of spatial, but not of hierarchical steppe migration. Since this one little 5-year window does not allow Alexander to follow actual people over several steps of this possible steppe migration process, he decides to add a second dimension of data to his research and come at the problem from a different angle. He zeroes in on Pittsburgh and surrounding Allegheny County in Pennsylvania in particular, because this area provides a great example of a city where the black population increased very fast through the early decades of the 20th century, mostly in response to active recruitment of industrial workers to come to the city from the southern states. Since detailed census data such as birthplace or residence 5 years earlier was not available to him from census records due to privacy and confidentiality restrictions for such small geographic areas, he has to look around for a new data source. He settled on marriage records because in Allegheny County, both marriage partners reported both race and detailed birthplace, as well as age and occupation, and even similar information for their parents. He quickly admits that such data have a lot of limitations. For one thing, he's only looking at marriages from the first half of the 1930s. Why he did not look at a longer period of time remains puzzling, because he might have seen trends over time and other important details, but perhaps he had limited time and resources to do this work. A more serious problem is that many of the migrants who came to Allegheny County from the southern states probably already were married before they came, so only the younger children of migrant families and a few of the unmarried adults would be showing up in local marriage documents after arriving at the end of their migratory journey. There's also a problem of some couples not bothering with formal marriages. We may think of this as a modern development in the last few decades, but during the Depression years of the 1930s, many couples may have hesitated about getting married until they could see which way the economic winds would blow in the next few years. To convince us that we can trust the results from his sample of marriage records, Alexander does a couple of quick calculations and shows us in his Table 1 that the occupations listed by black men filling out marriage licenses showed almost exactly the same distribution of job types as captured by the 1930 census reports of occupations for all black men in the county. He reinforces this with his Table 2 that shows that the couples filing marriage documents in the county came from almost the same mix of states as the total black population of the county too. He then has to deal with the problem that sometimes the couples, and even more often the court clerks taking down information for the forms, seemed to be in a hurry and didn't always put in much information about where the new husband and wife had come from in terms of details of place of birth. Finally, though, he feels that he has enough data on a sample of some 300 marriage license applications to show how well this information fits with his other observations about steppe migration during the Great Migration. We turn next to his findings in that regard. Alexander has done his best to convince us that his sample of over 300 marriage license applications in Allegheny County gives a representative picture of black migrants from the South in the 1930s. He then uses the information from these forms to look for evidence of his steppe migration thesis. He immediately finds one of the same patterns in these records that he noticed in 1940 census data about where people had been 5 years earlier. Fully 2/3 of all the people who gave birthplaces in southern states on the marriage applications also reported coming from urban areas. Alexander points out that only 1/3 of the black residents of the South in the 1930 census had lived in urban places. So this means that migrants from urban areas in the South were greatly overrepresented among these marriage applicants. This looks like evidence in support of the steppe migration hypothesis. When looking at census data earlier, he suggested that migrants leaving the rural South went instead to other southern cities, representing a previous step in the steppe migration process. Looking at this question from a slightly different angle, he takes advantage of the fact that his sample of marriage licenses come not just from the big city of Pittsburgh, but also from surrounding smaller towns like Millvale, Ingram, Rankin, Etna, Ross, and Homestead, where they sought employment in a range of businesses, from railways and factories to agriculture and construction. Using the same categories he applied to census data, Alexander looks at the birthplaces listed on the marriage licenses and classifies them as either rural, that is, places with less than 2,500 people in the previous 1930 census, or one of his two categories of urban, from 2,500 to 100,000 people, or over 100,000 people. A third of all Southern black couples living in the city of Pittsburgh itself had been born in big cities in the South. In fact, he goes on to add that most of their parents also had been born in these same big cities in the South, but only 14% of Southern black couples living in the outlying satellite towns around Pittsburgh had been born in such big Southern cities. The other side of this coin is that nearly half, 42%, of all these couples in the satellite towns had come from birthplaces in the rural South, compared to only about a fourth of the couples from Pittsburgh. These contrasts confirm what he saw in 1940 census data for where people had lived 5 years earlier. The migrants from the rural South tended to go to the smaller towns around Pittsburgh, while the migrants from the urban South tended to move directly into the city of Pittsburgh itself. These contrasting migrant streams appear to represent two different stages of the steppe migration process. The marriage license forms also give Alexander more detailed information about the people in these different migrant streams. He considers the question of why black migrants from the rural South were more likely to go to the smaller towns around Pittsburgh instead of moving into the city itself. It could be that they were not ready, as he puts it, for life in the big city. In particular, he finds that these couples from the rural South also tended to work in lower skilled kinds of occupations, so they might not even have been able to afford living in the city itself. In addition, fewer of them were literate, and many aspects of life in Pittsburgh proper demanded at least a rudimentary ability to read and write in order to navigate the daily round of life. It is particularly interesting that the occupational responses given on these license applications show that women who had moved from larger urban areas in the South tended to find better jobs in the North than the women who came from smaller towns or rural backgrounds. Familiarity with some of the features of urban living apparently paid off for these women after moving to Pittsburgh. But the same was not true for black men filling out these forms. Their jobs showed no such relation to where they had come from in the South. Alexander is not too clear about why this pattern existed for women in his sample, but not for the men. And it was not just where a person came from that mattered for women, but not for men. He concludes that employers rarely paid any attention to the skill qualifications of black men. These men always had to start at the bottom of the job ladder in any factory or road gang or other workplace where they might find a job, doing the least skilled, lowest paid, and often most dangerous and unpleasant work. Although he has to reach into the realm of speculation to some extent about this gender difference in employment, Alexander does offer one possible explanation. He suggests that some of the jobs for migrant black women in Pittsburgh and surrounding towns might have been found, as in other northern cities, in local black-owned small businesses, such as sales clerks, bookkeepers, and other relatively good jobs, and that many of these jobs demanded the literacy and other skills that tended to go along with coming from an urban background in the South. The men, on the other hand, were usually working in larger corporate-owned factories, on the railroads, or in other settings where they represented a small minority of outsiders within a larger job force and were subjected to more pervasive racial exclusion and discrimination by such employers and their other workers. This distinction is confirmed when he looks at the educational attainment reported by couples on the marriage forms. The women with more education also tended to have better jobs, while literacy and years of school reported had nothing to do with the kinds of jobs held by the men filling out these forms. These kinds of returns to schooling for women, but not for men, might help to explain why, for as long as we have any records about educational attainment in the black population in the United States,
Black women have been far more likely to complete high school and go on to college than have black men. This educational difference goes all the way back to at least the beginning of the 20th century, as captured in literacy statistics of those early census counts, and is true whether we're looking at rural or urban populations in the North or in the South. School has never paid off in America for black men the way it has for black women. So the marriage license data examined by Alexander on the whole confirms and elaborates his conclusions drawn from the 1940 census data on place of residence 5 years earlier. The direct migration pattern observed by other scholars in the first wave of the Great Migration involved people who moved directly from rural southern homes into the great industrial cities of the North in response to their insatiable appetite for more laborers. Alexander has shown us that already by the 1930s, this early pattern probably had been replaced by a more complex chain of stages, with people leaving the rural South mainly for southern cities, or perhaps for smaller cities in the North, and then later moving on from there to the biggest industrial cities like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, or Chicago. In some cases, these stages may even have taken more than one generation to complete. But in the end, African Americans made their way from the rural South at the start of the 20th century to become even more urbanized than the white population, relocating to the great industrial cities of the North by the end of the century.